Hello. Today I'm going to be reading the first few chapters from The Humble Little Condom. Let's get a drink of water. Okay, now begin. 1. Papyrus, Serpents, and Loincloths. The Ancients and the Condom. Long before boy Pharaoh King Tut came to the throne, a prehistoric artist chronicled a man and a woman having sex with his penis covered. The 12,000-year-old cave art found in France's grottedescombarelles has no caption explaining just what the couple had in mind. But since their discovery in the late 19th century, archaeologists and historians have debated as to whether the fecund cavemen and cave women were actually practicing safe sex. Sexuality in ancient Egypt was open, untainted by guilt. Even the Egyptian gods were positively promiscuous, earthy enough to copulate with abandon, their lives filled with tales of adultery, incest, homosexuality, masturbation, and necrophilia. The Egyptians were sex obsessed, and that obsession was often displayed in phallic worship. One of their creation stories has Chaos, their god of creation, masturbating, the act that produced all of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. Then there is the strange little god Bes, usually depicted as a dwarf who alternatively looked after childbirth and procreation, along with his other duties, and had a phallus that reached all the way to the ground. Bes's importance grew to such an extreme that rooms where the inhabitants were most likely to have sex were dubbed best chambers. With all this love, and given the fact that Egyptians preferred small families, these technologically advanced people developed a number of methods to prevent too many or inconvenient pregnancies. Hieroglyphics from the 2nd century CE recommended both male and female castration to prevent conception. Surgeries like the ovariotomy, the removal of the ovaries, were mentioned in medical papyri as a radical attempt to control fertility. But most methods were far less intrusive and were used only by women. Probably the most common was the tampon, a wadded up linen strip treated with spermicidal acidic oils or herbs. There were also herbal concoctions recommended in case the other precautions failed. Recipes for drinks that would cause a woman to abort, a common practice that sparked no moral debates, were shared from generation to generation. Various medical papyri also describe devices and recipes for making psaries, which are a sort of female condom that prevents semen from going all the way in, but does not actually trap it. Closer still to the male version, there was the halved, hollowed out pomegranate shell, which served as a barrier. But what did the men use? Strap on penises, loincloths, and papyrus. Their exact origins are unknown, but early penis sheaths undoubtedly developed out of the clothing styles favored by Egyptian men. Pharaohs and gentlemen of the upper ranks in Egyptian society wore short skirts, which were designed to project far out in front, emphasizing the wearer's anatomy with a triangular pleat. But it was the laboring classes who unintentionally designed the modern condom, worn for protection against sunburn, sand, and bug bites. Working men's loincloths and girdles were little more than penis sacks held on by a strip of cloth or a leather thong and tied around the waist. These were especially comfortable because they gave the workers freedom of movement as they fished, worked on their boats, and did laundry along the shore of the Nile. But by the 12th dynasty, 1350 through 1200 BCE, of the Middle Kingdom, there were written descriptions of men who were not common laborers wearing what were many years later dubbed glans condoms, small sheaths that covered only the top of the penis. These were made from oiled animal intestines or bladders, materials that remain popular even today. The fact that they were so small and made of such fine fabric meant they would not have been intended as a garment or to be worn for an extended period. The tiny bit of fabric would not have stood up to long-term wear and tear, sweat and sun. So even though the chronicler who described them did not come out and just say what the point of the diminutive garment was, the gland's sheath would surely have been worn while having sex. Even better examples are actual artifacts found in the tombs of aristocrats. These have yielded stashes of form-fitting penis sheaths made from soft animal skins and decorated with fur, some dyed in bright colors. Judging by what they packed, the men must have been deeply concerned about their sex lives in the netherworld. Along with their fancy condoms, they were also careful to include a supply of strap-on penises made from fine tortoise shell and mother of pearl. Some of these tools were carefully stored away for the journey, while others were already attached to the mummies. How popular was papyrus? Ancient rumor has it that some pharaohs put on papyrus condoms before having sex with women they did not want to impregnate, placing a paper condom, although these were made from only the most refined papyrus, over the royal member certainly illustrates the willingness of a powerful man to diminish his pleasure because of concern about sowing the royal seed in the wrong field. That has been a concern for many powerful men in history. Perhaps it is odd that, though they designed the first sheath, there is no definitive evidence that the average Egyptian man thought of it as an actual birth control device. Most likely, only when a man of consequence was doubtful about his partner's cleanliness or was worried about leaving behind evidence of an adulterous relationship was he likely to speak of protection. This remained a primary reason for men bothering with condom-like coverings for thousands of years. And of course, the blunting of sensation may also have been the culprit, or perhaps because it was men who were the scribes of history. The papyri and other written discussions of contraception rarely did more than hint at men taking responsibility. One sperm or two. Whose fault is it anyway? As with other societies, early and modern, The ancient Greeks are a mixed bag when it comes to sex and sexuality. On the one hand, Greek art catalogs homosexual acts, naked men playing sports with other naked men, and all forms of prostitution. Rape was common, considered the right of men in a show of domination over women. The great god Zeus was the master rapist, disguising himself so that he could ravish both men and women. Greek women had no choice about marriage partners and were considered property under law. They had little or no say over their own fates. Greek philosophers wrote of the ineptitude of women, and men generally thought all women suffered from penis envy. Yet there is another, softer side to Greek society, some elements that lend a more sensual sense to what it was to be Greek. The agora was a place in which people from all backgrounds came together and demonstrated the social and sociable side of daily life. And the Greek world was full of romantic gods and goddesses, bigger than life architectural wonders, and a passion for the word. Drama, poetry, and comedy are reflective of the Greek spirit of the peoples themselves. In this potent, male dominated, ugly beautiful, sexually charged, yet sexually ambivalent world, what was the common knowledge regarding contraception? And was the humble condom important? A sign that female a sign that the female does not emit the kind of seed that the male emits, and that generation is not due to the mixing of both, as some hold, is that often the female conceives without experiencing the pleasure that occurs in intercourse. That's a quote from Aristotle, 4th century BCE. In his book Republic 2, 372 BCE, Socrates described a pastoral paradise where there were only small families, lest they fall into poverty and war. He was concerned that too many mouths to feed could lead to hunger and despair. Hesiod also preached the small family ethic, but his concern was about keeping the wealth in the family. Hope for an only son to nourish his father's house, for this is how wealth waxes in the hall. Among the wealthy and the middle classes, the Greek ideal was a boy to carry on the line and a girl to be married off to help create useful family alliances. Greek tradition required that sons inherit, and the always practical Greeks understood the potential damage to the wealth and power of the family if there were too many boys to provide for. But how did they engineer this perfect family? Considering how long it took the modern Western world to scientifically prove just what causes pregnancy, it appears the ancients had some pretty good ideas as to what caused it and how to prevent it, and some interesting debates while figuring it all out. Great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle argued that because of women's inferior status, it had to be men's semen that produced an embryo. Women in her conception and generation is but the imitation of the earth and not the earth of the woman. A woman's contribution to the process was her body as the receptacle for the man's seed. But those who debated this singular theory were challenged by others who were not quite as anti woman and definitely more logical. They put forth the argument that both men and women had to produce seed because children could look like either parent. Hippocrates was one of a number of medical philosophers who believed both parties produced semen and that conception was a very complex process involving both parents. Whether they subscribe to Hippocrates or Aristotle's theories, when physicians and philosophers wrote about birth control, they made it clear that that was the woman's responsibility. There were many medical treatises noting recipes for contraceptive herbal concoctions, some to be taken internally, others made into pessaries. Aristotle the success, wrote of witnessing the success of anointing that part of the womb on which the seed falls with oil of cedar, or with ointment of lead, or with frankincense, commingled with olive oil. He even advocated for abortion, florine, should devices fail. Aristotle was not alone. Hippocrates recommended that to end a pregnancy, a woman should jump up repeatedly, her heels touching her bottom. In a Hippocratic medical treatise, along with contraceptive advice, much of it bogus, there are a number of abortificants listed, some of them intended to be used as suppositories, others to be taken orally, and many of the methods advocated by Greek physicians, the recipes and directions, are so similar to the Egyptians that it is obvious there was a lot of sharing going on across the Aegean. Semen of serpents and scorpions. In life, if life imitates art, then Greek legend is the best place to find evidence that the condom played a role in Greek life. In his 2nd century CE book of mythical tales, Metamorphoses, Greek philosopher Antonius Liberalis told the story of King Minot. The legend helps illuminate the use of condoms, but leaves the reader wondering just who wore them and why. Some translations of this mighty king's life have it that because of a curse put upon him by his wife, angry about his many infidelities, poor Minot had semen that contained serpents and scorpions. In order to prevent these monsters from killing his sex partners, Minot put on a condom which captured the offending wildlife, and an interesting spin on safe sex. Other versions have it that it was Minot's partners who wore condoms. In one way or the other, the legend tells us that these early people understood the significance of capturing a man's seed. But the origin of the Greek sheath is not quite so dramatic. Like the Egyptians, Greek laborers wore brief coverings to protect themselves from the elements while working outside and from possible damage while playing in sporting events. Evidence from a number of different dynastic periods has led some archaeologists to believe that there were at least 2 popular styles of sheaths used by the Greeks. They both bear a strong resemblance to the modern condom. One of these was made up of a covering for the penis and a testicle pouch. This double condom had a cord threaded through it that was tied around the wearer's waist. The other sheath was a single covering that did not cover the testicles and was held on by a ribbon. Some of these were quite elaborately dyed with vegetable pigments and were not always very form-fitting, and some of them were really long, at least 13 centimeters. Please don't interrupt us. But when did Greeks use condoms? In his discussion of family size, Plato talked of the many devices available to check propagation. Perrault, 7th century mercenary and poet, wrote, "And all her lovely body fondling, I also let go with my force, just touching, though her tawny down." References like references like Perrault references like Perrault's are peppered throughout Greek writing and have usually been interpreted to mean the practice of coitus interruptus. But there are those who believe these are subtle references to condom use, in spite of the somewhat misogynistic and sometimes confused philosophers and medical men who dumped responsibility for small families on women. There were men who chose to practice birth control on their own. Herodotus reported that Pisistratus, the 6th century tyrant of Athens, did not want to have children by his new wife, and so had intercourse with her not according to custom. Again, experts have interpreted this as coitus interruptus, or anal intercourse, but it is very possible that Pisistratus was actually doing what the Egyptian pharaohs had done. He may have used one of those animal intestine condoms to make sure he remained the sole power in Athens. In a society as sexually charged as that of the Greeks, where concubinage, homosexuality, and elaborate orgies were an accepted part of life, it seems likely that the condom, however surreptitiously, was a quiet addition to the more public birth control methods favored by the Greeks, especially by those men who trusted no one but themselves to prevent an unwanted pregnancy or chose to explore sex with women of the lower ranks or slaves. In a society that was so promiscuous, it simply made sense. If it was good enough for a Greek king, it was surely good enough for the rest of Greek society. Contagion, confusion, and Roman sex. I hate and I love. Perhaps you ask why I do that. Catullus, 2nd century CE. When Rome consumed the older and more sophisticated world of the Greeks, Romans inherited a great deal of information about how to prevent unwanted pregnancies and avoid sexually transmitted infections. And, like the Greeks, men called all the shots. Sex in ancient Rome was decidedly one sided. Men could get it anytime, anywhere. Exotic sex was easy to find. Orgies and group sex were common, as were homosexual encounters. Household slaves and prostitutes provided a handy outlet for bored husbands. On the other hand, woman's role in Roman society was completely scripted. Wealthy girls were married to cement family alliances, and poor girls fended for themselves. Sex and love were not synonymous, and sex outside of marriage for women was a no no. Cato's examination of how husbands and wives were treated under law illustrates the differences between the consequences for men versus women if caught committing adultery. If you take your wife in adultery, you may freely kill her without a trial. But if you commit adultery, or if another commits adultery with you, she has no right to raise a finger against you. Men dictated the laws and they benefited from their own handiwork. Though much has been made by historians of the importance of family and children to the Romans, it was not a Roman goal to keep wives barefoot and pregnant. They wanted small families. Reminiscent of the Greeks, the ideal was to have no more than one or two children in order to prevent the splitting up of family wealth as a result of too many boys to provide for and too many girls, often married off by 12, who were worthless except to create or maintain family alliances. But there was another reason, one a number of increasingly worried emperors tried to address, but with no luck. Big families cost a lot to rear, and wealthy and middle class women did not appreciate the wear and tear on their bodies. Some well to do Romans were even honest enough to say that they did not want a lot of children because it would prevent them from enjoying the many entertainments available in Roman cities, cutting into their time at the Colosseum. But their commitment to small families was not a minor footnote in the history of the Roman Empire. It was a contributing factor to its fall. Because the small family philosophy was so widespread, by the first century CE, the population of free Roman citizens had plummeted, making it difficult to fill the ranks of the huge army and to provide the infrastructure necessary to maintain history's large empire. In fact, Augustus was so worried about the common practice of family limitation that he demanded the Senate pass legislation making any kind of contraception illegal. Roman literature, Roman literature, literature, Roman literature, however, makes it clear that in spite of the heavy penalty for breaking this law, Romans remain dedicated to small family size. For a woman forbids herself to conceive and fights against it. Lucretius, 50 BCE, or Lucretius, 50 BCE. Pater familias, father of the family, is a term that refers to Roman men's complete and legally sanctioned control over the family, including wives. A woman could say nothing about the dalliances between her husband and a pretty slave girl. Excuse me. A wife had little influence in her own home. In spite of that low standing, or possibly because of it, Roman men, like their Greek counterparts, expected their wives to deal with contraception. Though a serious burden, this responsibility made may actually, though a serious burden, this responsibility may actually have empowered some women and allowed them to have the final say in the number of children they had, or even to stray from the constraints of dominant husbands and a demanding code of law. Although plenty of fairly common Roman contraceptives were no more than magical potions, a squashed spider worn under the left arm was a favorite. Roman women also had very potent birth control choices at their disposal. Herbal potions from commonly available plants, like Queen Anne's lace, were effective contraceptives, and tampons soaked in oils or acidic liquids, identical to those used by Egyptian women, were very popular. But did Roman men participate in family planning? The Romans believed that semen was the essence of a man's maleness. They were very public about worship of the fascinum, phallus, which was the symbol of both war and love. Roman bakers were proud of their perfect loaves of phallus shaped bread. Covering the coveted object might seem anathema to these penis lovers, but there are many veiled references to men covering themselves with condom like sheaths. The clues to Roman condom use can be found in the creative language of reticent Roman chroniclers and in hints peppered throughout Roman literature, medical, military, fictional, and personal. Whether from concerns about being caught in adulterous affairs with the wives of important men, from the fear of infection, or from the commitment to assure a small family. Even in this male dominated society, Roman men did use protection. Boy, that stings. Gossip records a miracle. To rub it all over the male part before coition prevents conception. Pliny the Elder, 1st century CE. Although most of the devices and concoctions recommended to Roman men for protective or preventative use while having sex were at best quirky, they do offer a glimpse at how serious Roman men were about avoiding the unfortunate consequences of having sex, especially illicit sex. Pliny the Elder's miracle involved rubbing the penis with cedar oil, which may have stung a bit, but Pliny's was not the only unguent recommended as a penis protector or covering. There were plenty of recipes directing men to brew up thick, gooey substances to apply to the penis before sex. The sometimes greasy, often smelly concoctions could not catch the seed, but their astringent and highly acidic ingredients had spermicidal qualities that may or may not have been effective. The condom circus and filthy slippers. Although those gooey coverings were examples of men participating in birth control, when it came to condoms, like those who came before and who would follow, it was all about protecting the men from the women. A rare exception was after a day at the games, the deadly tournaments fought by brave gladiators in the Roman amphitheaters were known for more than their bloodletting. They were also notorious for their after the show trysts. It was a dirty little secret that married women found the winning gladiators very, very sexy. The more battle worn and scarred, the better. Well to do women watched, enthralled, as their men fought. Then they met up with their tough paramours after the show. Although adultery was common, it was still dangerous for the woman, legally punishable by death. That and the fact that the women did not want to spoil it all by becoming pregnant made contraception vital. But it was not the only consideration for these daring women. Gladiators were not the cleanest choice of lovers. It has been posited that part of the lusty bargain was the promise to use sheaths to protect the ladies from infection and detection. And then there were the other ladies. Roman prostitutes were referred to as the publica via, the public footpath, inferring the prostitute's role in society as analogous to all that was dirty and degrading. Sprecare, dirt, was used in some of the most common metaphors describing prostitutes. Yet the great Roman writers speak often of the necessity of prostitution in Roman society as an outlet for men who did not want to impregnate their wives, who were away from home a great deal traversing the empire, or who wanted to explore the kinkier side of life. Prostitution was so prevalent and varied in ancient Rome that there were dozens of Latinate euphemisms describing prostitutes and their wares. Latin was so deeply influenced by the Roman love hate relationship with prostitutes. Even architectural terms were borrowed to describe paid for sex. Streetwalkers, those who were not managed by pimps or who did not operate out of brothels, used the arcades, the corridors formed by the large arches at the circus buildings, common throughout Roman cities and towns, to turn quick tricks. These little hideaways or fornaces provided the root for the modern English word fornication. Prostitutes' vital and revealed role in society is even reflected in Augustine's writing. Banish prostitutes from society, and you reduce society to chaos through unsatisfied lust. His statement illustrates the Roman ambiguity over prostitution, at once a necessity and a degrading, vilified practice. Indeed, the most insulting, dirty reference about the Roman prostitute and her clients is the filthy slipper, a dual comment and on her cleanliness and the use of condoms. The men who use the services of prostitutes, especially those men with power and place in society, did not want to suffer the all too possible contagion when walking the public footpath. They wore filthy slippers for protection. Neigh-Winnie and the Magic Condom. One of the many odd Roman condoms was also purported to have had magical qualities that protected the users from pregnancy and evil spirits. Magic or not, it was definitely unique, not only for being a joint effort, but also because of the material it was fashioned from. To make the magic condom, the woman was directed to collect a large handful of fur from a she-mule's mane. As a sort of foreplay, the man and the woman hand-wove a furry condom, and then she helped him put it on. The origins of this she-mule hair condom have been lost to time, but it leaves the modern reader wondering which would be the greatest obstacle to enjoyment and safety, the possible leakage or the incredible itch. Maybe that was the magic. Managing to have sex wearing the strange contraption. Mount Vesuvius's Rash and flexing their muscles. Although there are many veiled references to condom use by Roman men, they were most commonly used by one group, Roman soldiers. During many campaigns, the armies of Rome were supplied with comfort women, usually captives taken after battle. These poor women made up the majority of workers in the military brothels, but there were also women who voluntarily followed the army, living with and around the soldiers, accompanying them from campaign to campaign. At the 106 BCE Battle of Arusio, yes, really. For example, there were 80,000 troops and 40,000 camp followers. Camp followers at any battle or post were a mixed group. Some were the legal wives of soldiers who dragged their household goods and children along with them, but more commonly, they were prostitutes who found the army a steady means of employment. Although there was a certain reciprocity in the lifestyle, sex for security, the casual nature of these relationships had its risks. Prior to the 15th century, it is not known if sexually transmitted diseases were a serious public health threat. Certainly, sexually transmitted infections were known and dreaded. Hence, wealthy men protected themselves when they used the services of prostitutes. Reports like the one from Ratius and Cappadocian, 2nd century CE, might have been describing a mild precursor to gonorrhea, or more likely something like a yeast infection, when he spoke of men with not indeed a deadly affection, but one that is disagreeable and disgusting even to hear of. Aretius blames women for the problem. Women also have this disease, but their semen is discharged with titillation of the parts, and with pleasure, and from immodest desires of connection with men. But men have not the same prurient feelings. Who carried which kind of infection was not as important to the common foot soldier, however, as it was to the medical minds of the time. What many military men did know and care about was that having sex meant exposure to a variety of nasty infections. Legend has it Roman soldiers lumped these together with the term Mount Vesuvius's rash. Roman legions often kept herds of goats with them as a hearty and handy source of meat and milk. Savvy soldiers, like those before and after, figured out what to do with the otherwise useless goat bladders or intestines, which made pretty fair penis sheaths. This could easily have been a technique inherited when they invaded the Greeks. The soldiers covered their glands using pieces of dried and stretched bladder, and kept the condoms in place by tying small pieces of leather or string around the tops of the penis. In Roman Britain, officials whose job it was to oversee the business of skins and hides were directed to supply prepared skins to armies going off to war, an important military lesson learned and unlearned by later armies from the 17th to the 20th centuries. The most exotic male covering in the history of the Roman Empire, maybe in all of Western history, was also the brainchild of the Roman soldier. Legends about just how far victorious Roman soldiers would go to prove or celebrate their superiority in the field tell of a remarkable covering. This victory condom was made out of the muscle, some versions say just the skin, from an enemy soldier defeated in battle. From the sinewy material, the Roman soldier fashioned his covering by stretching the muscle tissue and soaking it in oil to soften it. Whether the material was shaped in place, then attached with a ribbon or string is unclear, but the victory condom was a symbol of the warrior's bravery and skill in battle. And with women, it is only a guess that the women who were at the receiving end of this device may have had mixed feelings about its use. Did the condom fall, too? When the Roman Empire fell, and the western half of that once great power was left to fend for itself, the rich world of science and politics the Romans had borrowed, created, and spread throughout their world shrank, taking almost a millennia to fully reawaken. But does that mean that those left to cope with the fractured remnants of empire lost the knowledge of the ancients? Was there a feudal condom? Chapter 2. From sex for delight to the great pox. Love in early modern Europe. A husband would please me, though, but to bear children, I believe, is a great penance, since the breasts fall down and the belly becomes heavy and burdening. By a 13th century poetess. Buried deep in the ancient art, poetry, and chronicles of the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans is the story of the ancient sheaths that men wore mostly to protect themselves from disease and sometimes from the entanglements of an unwanted pregnancy. But for some reason, traditional historians of the Middle Ages have insisted that when Rome fell, the understanding and practice of any sort of birth control was lost, and that the medievals did nothing to limit family size. And of course, they lived short, brutish, and sexually ambivalent lives. So there was no need, not quite. Although there were cataclysmic changes that accompanied the end of empire, and the center of power was lost to that localized notion of rule called feudalism by the 11th century medieval treaties, diaries, and literary sources were full of references, some veiled, many literal, to and about human sexuality, including directions on how to prevent or end pregnancy. And they more than hint at the fact that the condom did have quite a quiet role in the lives of some early Europeans. In fact, in many ways, this unique period in Western history could be interpreted as a pretty sexy one. By the 1000s, popular literature portrayed the emergence of serious sexual exploration, with men and women both romantic partners, as both romantic partners and combatants in the medieval version of the Battle of the Sexes. At the same time, the church was becoming very concerned about dictating the terms in regard to what went on behind closed doors. However, as so often happens in history, what was preached was not always what was practiced. The church provided a cozy niche for those who enjoyed lots of sexual experimentation and exploitation. Some friars, nuns, and even a pope or two were anything but chaste. Outlawing devices. The legal codes of England's Edward I provide a serious glimpse into how widespread the practice of birth control was in the early Middle Ages. His laws made it illegal to provide a woman with any kind of birth control device or advice. And like the Roman emperors who tried to outlaw the practice, codes of law could do little to prevent it. Female neighbors, friends, and relatives quietly educated one another, and there were even those who actually made a living from growing the herbs and collecting the flora necessary to make contraceptive medicaments. As history proved, then and later, watchful leaders were rarely successful in catching and prosecuting wrongdoers because, as long as people wanted to check propagation so badly that they would thumb their noses at the law, and others found the practice profitable enough to make crossing the legal line worthwhile, there would be no way to prevent it. Perhaps even more telling is that there was nothing mentioned in Edward's codes about punishments for men if they got caught informing about or selling devices. Sinon castitamen crut, if not chastely, at least cautiously, with care and precautions. A common philosophy about sex 11th through 13th centuries. In his Summa Conservationis et Curationis, 13th century Italian physician William of Salcito included a chapter on how to prevent pregnancy with mostly herbal mixes. He also explained how to induce abortion. His methods were borrowed from the more advanced medical knowledge of the Arab world, which in turn took a great deal from the ancients. But it was not the academics or the physicians of the Middle Ages who were the movers and shakers in the world of birth control. The very best source of information about just what the medievals knew was the clergy. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church got more and more involved in people's daily lives, especially regarding sexual relations. Clergymen pushed for doctrines that dictated sex was meant only for the marriage bed and strictly for the purposes of reproduction. Enjoyment was out. Church policy discouraged the faithful, as it still does, from practicing abortion or contraception. This very public campaign to limit people's libidos makes the fact that it was the church that housed most of the information about medieval birth control truly ironic. Even more amazing is that it was churchmen who performed much of the research that advanced the understanding of reproduction and how to prevent it. Some of the information came from surviving Greek and Roman treatises, painstakingly copied in Latin by patient monks hidden away in their scriptoriums. But monks did more than just copy old recipes. They actually experimented with the contraceptive concoctions and decoctions themselves. Growing, harvesting, mixing, and cooking the wide variety of flowers, herbs, and wild flora was a daily obsession for a cadre of padres. How they knew their brews worked is more difficult to ascertain, but many of the Many of the potions contained ingredients modern science has proven effective. Conversely, well traveled and worldly men and women of the church actually wrote about contraception in their diaries and letters, some of which became books of wisdom shared throughout their own dioceses and beyond. These mostly 14th century mendicant and Dominican friars learned a great deal in the confessional. When the brothers and priests heard the confessed sins of their parishioners, specifically those who felt a little bit guilty about making sure they did not become pregnant, infected, or did not plant a seed in the wrong furrow, and how they engineered it, the churchmen had a pretty good idea of just what worked and just how many people were actively trying to avoid unfortunate accidents. They also knew who was sleeping with whom. English friars like John Bromyard of Hereford and William of Pagula from the Salisbury diocese, along with French, Portuguese, and Italian brothers, peppered their written treatises with statements like Ne impregnata, lest she become pregnant, ne habet plures filos, in order not to have more children, propter quod impediatur conceptio partus, whereby conception be prevented. The references to pregnancy and prevention were all part of the clergy's practical advice, intended, of course, for married parishioners, passing on what the good friars had learned from those same folks. A 14th century English Carmelite nun went even further when she argued that birth control was a way to distinguish man from beast. But man does not just aim at generating offspring for the multiplication of the species like a beast. He aims at living a good and peaceful life with his wife. She did not give any advice as to how to limit offspring, but she provided a glimpse into the beginning of the birth control wars as they would be fought within the church itself. On the flip side, though, she was against the practice of any kind of birth control. Saint Catherine of Siena was not shy about discussing it in public. She bemoaned the fact that contraception was the most frequent sin of the married, who did not have as much conscience about it as their other sins, like stealing, swearing, and gluttony. And then there was Pierre Clergue of Montalieu, often referred to as the 13th century's fornicating priest, who noted in his diaries that he made sure his lover was using what sounded like a female condom when he asked if she was using their method of birth control. The pomegranate is back. Although not a member of the church, 13th century Italy's Dame Torotula, called history's first woman gynecologist, also offered rather vague advice to women with female troubles. She recommended that old favorite, the pomegranate, be worn as a pessary, just as in ancient Egypt, women were told to cut the fruit in half, hollow it out, and insert it. She left out when and why a woman should wear a pomegranate, but considering the parallels between the old world and the emerging modern one, The dame was probably just being cautious or coy when she committed a bit of her contraceptive knowledge to vellum, trying to pass on her wisdom without setting herself up for prosecution by overzealous authorities. Persian Protection. Again, thanks to church documents, there is plenty of evidence that men did practice birth control. What is missing is any mention of preventatives against sexually transmitted infection. The most common reason for men of the ancient world's willingness to cover up. By the Middle Ages, however, the understanding of the relationship between sex and infection was only tacitly acknowledged. The Norman English referred to la chaude pisse, hot piss, a common ailment thought to have been caused by having sex with a dirty prostitute. By the 12th century, there was a law that prohibited brothel keepers of Southward in London from allowing women suffering from the perilous infirmity of burning to work for them. And 14th century English references to a similar problem included the gleet, trepert, and tripper. But until the late Renaissance, these infections, which, as with earlier periods, some medical historians believe were mild forms of gonorrhea, were all lumped together along with diseases unrelated to sex, specifically leprosy. However, during the Middle Ages, the coverings used by men were not intended as protection from disease. They were birth control. As demonstrated by William of Salcetto's work, there is evidence that the earliest trailblazers who re-established contact with the new Islamic world returned from their travels with information about contraceptive methods, which included the condom. Persians, for instance, mention penis coverings made from leathery materials made to be worn while having sex. This reintroduced or reinforced the use of the quiet experimentation with the condom in Europe. Often called the Hippocrates of the Islamic world, Abu Bakr Muhammad bin Zakaria al-Razi, 900 CE, was a Persian doctor who wrote about contraception. His work was as much an exploration of moral do's and don'ts as a contraception how to. But buried in his philosophies, al-Razi listed the reasons why there were times when semen should not be allowed in. Like his Roman and European counterparts, al-Razi's wording is typically vague, but his explanation of how to avoid getting it in while still having sex sounds a lot like using a condom. Others in the Islamic world suggested condom like coverings made from tar, which could not have been much worse than the male birth control recommended by a 12th century Jewish physician. Soak the penis in pure juice of the onion. Courtly or corporeal. And there go the fair and courteous ladies who have friends, two or three, besides their wedded lord. 12th century verse. Literature of the Middle Ages celebrated courtly love, traditionally defined as a chaste and pure relationship between the brave knights and the lovely ladies of the European courts. The men worshipped and adored their beloveds from afar, their love remaining unrequited. But medieval poetry and less romantic tales recount some satisfyingly sexy relationships. Here, youth and their lemans, mistresses, stroll through leafy groves where grass sprung up as thick set and soft as any velvet, on which men might their laments lay, as on a feather bed to play. Chaucer, Book of Duchess. In other works, Chaucer was not quite so subtle when he referred to the relationships of court members. He also proved that medievals did enjoy sex and practice birth control, both of which he disapproved. In the Nun's Priest's Tale, courtly lovers had more than affairs of the heart. They had sex that was more of delight than world to multiply. And he wrote vociferously against any man who putteth certain material finages in chaos secret places, and as doth unkindly sign by which man or woman she death chaya nature seed in manere, or in place there as a child may not be conceived. Scholars always assumed this meant Chaucer was against the practice of abortion, but it might actually be Chaucer against the condom. He and other writers of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance unintentionally helped explain how, in spite of the fact that the nobility often flaunted extramarital and premarital affairs, pregnancy was notably absent in references to the benighted lovers who experimented with courtly love. But did the knights of the realm actually use armor other than the chain mail variety? Although there is not a great deal of evidence that condom use was widespread or widely understood in the Middle Ages, there is plenty of evidence that many men worked hard to make sure that having sex, especially the illicit variety, would not have any nasty repercussions. The knights, as chivalrous, gallant, and worldly as they were, would have been aware of the methods they could use to spare their precious laments the discomfort and embarrassing after effects of the delight. Hopefully, none of them followed one very powerful birth control expert's advice. Hopefully, none of them followed one very powerful birth control expert's advice. A papal recommendation. A very interesting description of a male covering came from another clergyman, but this one was not tucked away in a scriptorium. He was a pope. Pope John the 21st was born Peter of Spain in the 13th century. The son of a physician, Pope John studied at the University of Paris and became a medical lecturer at the University of Siena. This Dr. Pope wrote quite a bit about contraception. He catalogued the herbs women could use for birth control, and he called upon men to show restraint. But he also recommended a condom made out of a paste from the bark and leaves of the hemlock tree. Pope John, however, must have had a somewhat limited understanding of sex. His pasty condom covered the testicles, not the penis. Another 13th century sex expert, Antonius, wrote about contraceptives in a pseudo-medical treatise with the guilty title Confessional of Antonius. The penitent writer spoke dramatically about his use of the poisons of sterility, a common church-inspired phrase encompassing all contraceptives. But it is Antimonius's oblique reference to what men could do to prevent accidents that makes the somewhat whimsical and very long tract both telling and entertaining. The author referred to two ways men could have sex using a vessel made out of soft hide. Though it is very vague, he recommends having sex outside the vessel and within the vessel. Like his fellows, Antimonius's language is veiled, but he leaves plenty of room to ponder the linguistic possibilities. Condom versus vessel. There is also the distinct possibility that Antimonius was neither anti contraception nor guilty. What would Leonardo have done? Was there a renaissance for the condom? As the Middle Ages progressed, the Catholic Church became more and more concerned about sex and how it related to sin. Yet the dichotomy remains that some of the most prolific birth control writers and experimenters were monks in the scriptoriums and friars in their parishes, and the many children running around the Vatican, sired by popes, the married priests with their behind the scenes families, and the generally lax attitude toward churchmen's sexual transgressions indicates that the married only sex for procreation message was not necessarily heeded even by insiders. Read that sentence again. And the many children running around the Vatican, sired by popes, the married priests with their behind the scenes families, and the generally lax attitude towards churchmen's sexual transgressions indicates that the married only sex for procreation message was not necessarily heeded even by insiders, let alone by the general populace. It also seems likely that the work of the busy monks in their scriptoriums was not read by some of their fellow churchmen, judging by the many illegitimate children of the clergy. In spite of the fantastic advances realized in science and technology during the Renaissance, however, there were no major breakthroughs in birth control methods by the 15th century. It remained mostly the responsibility of women who continued to take the same useful and useless potions of herbs their forebears had used, as well as employing a similar variety of psaries and female condoms. The tampon dipped in strong liquids with spermicidal qualities was reborn after an absence of at least 500 years. The odd recommendations for salves and tar-based testicle and penis coverings also remained in the birth control repertoire of the citizen of the Renaissance. And of course, there was always the magical amulet. But it was in the flourishing cities and the towns of Europe, especially in England and France, where tradesmen who worked with animal byproducts and kept their knowledge close to their sleeves knew how to make condoms and eventually how to market them To which diasakos do you go as a boy? I was educated by blows in the slaughterhouse. What wrestling did you learn from the paid tribes? To steal and perjure myself and look the other way. What technique did you have on coming to manhood? Sausage selling. From the Athenian Aristophanes' play, The Knights. The Knights. Sausage makers and glovers. The word sausage is derived from the Latin salsiccia, meaning salted, probably because thanks to salt, sausage was one of humankind's first preserved foods. The salt and spices in early varieties, like those favored by Babylonian King Nebuchadnezzar, meant that sausages stayed fresh for a long time. The Romans even used their beloved Neigh, small spicy links, in religious ceremonies. A favorite Greek play from the 5th century BCE was simply titled The Sausage. Haggis, an Old English, not Scottish Gaelic word, put the soupy kind of sausage on the map, and Homer even mentions sausages in his epic The Odyssey. And by the Middle Ages, the Italians had the biggest variety of sausage types ever. They still do. The sausage has quite a history, and one that has had great influence on another little item. The shape of both items is the first clue as to why the maker of one would figure out the use of the same material to make the other. Animal intestines, bladders, galls, skins have been used to make condoms for thousands of years. The most popular high quality sheath of the 20th century, 21st century is still made from gut. Historians interested in the origins of modern commerce and specifically the re-emergence of retail at the micro level have for years been making the vague but enduring claim that slaughterhouse workers were the first in early modern Europe to reinvent or discover an alternative use for animal guts. Probably true, but it is also true that sausage makers themselves had a minor side trade in providing cleaned, treated material for individual sale and, by the 16th century, to people who made a living out of making condoms for retail sales. Of course, the Europeans did not invent this alternative use, but it is likely that they thought they had. The fact that fewer than 3% of Europeans could read and write either in their own vernacular languages or in Latin is a good reason for the lack of clear and conscious records in regard to who sold what, for how much, and to whom. And considering what a blush can be raised in the 21st century when the little device is mentioned, it is little wonder that sausage makers, butchers, or slaughtermen did not pass on their knowledge about condoms in a public matter. They may also have feared the churchman and the taxman. The sausage makers of Europe and England were busy men and women with their own guilds. The Venetian Sausage Guild rivaled the Goldsmiths' Guild for its rich endowments to the Church of San Salvatore. They were also less regulated than standard butchers when it came to medieval law codes. In 13th and 14th century London, butchers were frequently fined for befouling streets, and even the Thames River with their awful blood and entrails. The sausage makers had no such worries. They bought their meats prepared, along with spices, salt, and animal bladders. In London, bladders were available from specialty butchers who did a vigorous trade on Blow Bladder Street, immortalized by Daniel Defoe, the son of a butcher, in his Journal of the Plague Year. Since at least 1284, the sausage mar- the sausage makers of Blowbladder, or just Bladder Street, came to buy cleaned and prepared intestines in order to produce their own variety of meat product and for resale. And though the sausage makers did not leave any receipts for their version of the condom, they would have resembled earlier primitive sheaths, but cut with meat cleavers, tied in a knot at one end to prevent leakage, and attached at the top with a ribbon or a string once on the wearer. Well, hurry up, in you go, sausage, nice and tight. The path is narrow. Don't, pray tell, don't you love this illustrious and rich blood sausage? How the treacherous one stings! It must be loaded with spices. Spanish author Baltasar del Alcazar, 17th century. In Hand Glove. Long before Shakespeare, whose father was a glover, had Cressida hand her glove to Triolos, symbolizing the sex act. The glove had been used in literature as a double entendre, a symbol for both the penis and the vagina, one which spoke to both the role of women and the role of men in sex. Glove making itself was a women friendly business during the Middle Ages, and women glovers had their own guilds. They also had a direct connection to slaughterhouse workers and butchers because they used some of the same materials to produce gloves as those other professions. And they too held the wisdom of the bladder condom and how to produce it for personal use, as well as to make a bit on the side. Lesser glovers, those allowed by guild law to make only linen or wool gloves, were not considered to be true professionals and did not belong to the Glovers Guild. But they also used the same materials as the condom makers, who preferred to produce linen sheaths. Both used fabric, and both were likely to finish off their products with strips of fabric or even ribbons. Female glovers, as well as the Jewish male glovers, increasingly turned to condom manufacturing as the Middle Ages and the Renaissance gave way to the 16th century, a time when the European economy was changing rapidly and was not so tolerant of women in the world of trade. Gone were the days when women worked side by side with men. Gone were the days when women worked side by side with men. And gone were the women's guilds that had dignified and protected the glover's profession. Women were pushed out of the business world, and those who remained often had to find outlets in fringe economies for their skills. Gloves to condoms was a logical move for some, and the women sausage makers suffered the same fate. By the 17th century, when condom makers were far more public than in the earlier years. Most manufacturers who made condoms on a grand scale were women, and in Spain and Italy, a few Jewish men who had been pushed into narrow professional roles during the anti Semitic Middle Ages fashioned skins to order. Is it any wonder, then, that the three most enduring euphemisms for the condom are bladder, skin, and glove?